Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Morning.
Thank you all for joining us on our panel on SpaceX. My name is Eli Burton, and I got invited here today because I am the creator of The Adventures of Starman. It's a comic book series I've created that documents the Falcon Heavy launch into space and the beginning of Starman's adventures through the galaxy. So, super honored and humbled to be moderating this panel. We have some really incredible guests, and we'll start with introductions, starting here from the very right, and we'll work our way down to the left. Go ahead, Bill.
Howdy, I'm Bill Carton, electrical engineer. Wished I worked in aerospace, but I haven't. But I was a fan since Mercury and even Vanguard days. Got disillusioned with the space program after Shuttle looked like it was more routine than it really was, and there were some incidents, but SpaceX got me excited again. New space rejuvenated me, took 20 years, added 20 years to my life. Now I want to get healthy to see us get to Mars. I run the Facebook enthusiast group with about 44,000 members.
If you guys are on Facebook and follow Space, join that group, and if you're not in it already. They definitely have all the most up-to-date information, and anytime a launch goes down, the most entertaining live comment feed I think I've ever seen.
What's the name of the group?
SpaceX.
Oh, okay.
If you just search for SpaceX group, not page, if it's got 40,000 members, 44,000 members, that's us.
Awesome, thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Sure. So my name is Chris Griffith. I'm actually a user experience designer, but I grew up actually in Bakersfield, California, so Edwards was just over the hill for me. So all of that early, middle space, you might call it, was happening as I was growing up. I'm actually an amateur space historian. Actually, last Friday I was up at Edwards Air Force Base to take a tour to actually see the only remaining lunar lander research vehicle that's on exhibit there that you have to get in. And by sheer luck, I actually got to go into the shuttle transfer vehicle. So when the shuttle landed in Edwards, those big things, if you've ever been in Dulles, got to go inside that and actually see the gurneys and all the medical stuff inside. And so for me, this SpaceX is like this new renaissance. I'm really excited to actually be around to see it and go from there.
So I'm Eli. I don't have any background in space, but I have been a very long time space fan since a very young age. As early as I can remember, watching shuttle launches, watching lunar eclipses, just always been obsessed on the subject. And for most of my life as a millennial, nothing exciting has really been happening. And then the SpaceX did the Falcon Heavy and did this whole Starman thing, and that really became the symbol of the moment for me to see that the next space race has really begun. So that's how I'm now expressing my passion and love for space by getting into comics and The Adventures of Starman.
I'm Gregory Binford. I'm a professor emeritus from UC Irvine. I've done work with NASA for several decades and did a series of experiments at JPL and then at UC Irvine on advanced beam-driven propulsion. But I've also been an advisor to NASA and several other government agencies over the decades. But as far as SpaceX is concerned, I'll just relate to the latest conversation I had when I was having dinner with Elon last year in his wonderful palatial home, which had just been turned down for a helicopter landing pad by the City Council of Beverly Hills, I think it was.
None of us are jealous you had dinner with Elon, by the way.
Yeah, and so he was kind of miffed with that because he hates the long commute down to SpaceX, which is, my God, it must be at least 15 miles. So it's only, it's maybe 2 hours. Which will tell you something about the motivation of the tunnels and the Hyperloop, and we talked about that too. But the short answer is that they really are building fairly quickly the Hyperloop testing range in Texas, and he envisions the first Hyperloop actually functioning railroad will be between Dallas and Austin, along the same track that he's running the test bed. But as far as SpaceX goes, I asked him what he knew about the Chinese efforts, and he said it's very kind of conflicting and everything, and he gets varying intelligence about it. But they, well, of course, they knew that the Chinese were going to land something on the back of the moon, which is fine. The latest I've heard about that, by the way, is that the drill hit a stone and they're having some troubles with it. They had thought that they'd not hit anything really hard. They were doing spectra of the regolith. Anyway, I asked him when the next hotel, i.e. the first hotel, would be in orbit, and he said, yeah, it's going to take a while longer than we thought. The Bigelow Hotel, as he refers to it as. And what the ticket would cost. I'm seriously thinking I might try to get a discount. The thing is, there'll be a physical training program too, and I ain't that young anymore, so there are problems, to say the least. But he was very optimistic about the rest, the Falcon and so forth. He thought it would continue to work, and he says once we were doing the regular flights, he was very, very happy with the idea that we would completely cut the Russians out of the space program. It's all about the time.
Is it done? My name is Mike Revine. I'm the Advanced Project Manager at Mail and Space Science Systems, and although I apparently am doing 4 panels at this thing, somehow they didn't manage to print me the little card with my name on it, but I'm not miffed about that at all.
Bill doesn't have one either.
Yeah. I build cameras for space missions. We have cameras all over the solar system. I think I'm the only person I know that was a science geek before I was a science fiction geek, because I became an astronomy geek when I was 7, and I didn't start reading Heinlein until I was 9. So, my only interactions with Elon were before he started SpaceX. He had this idea. He was concerned NASA wasn't doing a good enough job, and he had this idea. He was going to shame them into doing a better job, and his demonstration project for that was he was going to put a greenhouse on the surface of Mars and grow a plant. And it was apparently growing out of his interactions with the Russians trying to buy a launch vehicle and feeling like they were holding him ransom for it, that he decided that somebody needed to start a rocket company where rockets cost less, and I think that's where SpaceX started. So.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So to get this thing started, you know,
Usual comments.
So let it go.
it is. It's Commander Mark next door. So when it gets quiet over there, we should all just yell SpaceX.
It's 50 years of Batman.
All right, thanks a lot, Batman. Way to show up when you don't want to. Awesome. Okay, so SpaceX, our topic here is into orbit, back to the moon, onto Mars. So into orbit kind of is a good place to start, and that's, let's go a little bit into the background and the history of SpaceX, and Michael kind of mentioned a little bit of the why and Elon's interactions with the Russians. By the way, jokes on them. But let me hand this off to Bill, and he'll give a little bit of backstory of some of the history of SpaceX and how they got to where they are today, and then the rest of the panel will open it up to where they are now and where they're going. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the story we all grew up knowing was how Elon went to the Russians, tried to buy ICBMs. They wouldn't give him any kind of reasonable discount, pretty much spit on him, and it's really karma that he's going to take away their ability to sell us rides for $70 or $80 or $90 million to get to our own space station. So,
Yeah, it's working. It's working.
Okay, so he said, okay, gonna start a rocket company. His first friend's advice was, no, don't even try. It's ridiculous. You've got PayPal money, you're gonna lose it all. But his number 1 employee or partner was Tom Mueller. Worked at TRW, working on throttleable pintle injection engines. Pretty much Tom Mueller is the enabling technologist for SpaceX. And He developed the Kestrel engine and the first Merlin used on Falcon 1. They flew 5 of those from South Pacific, from Kwajalein Island on a leased Air Force site. The first 3 failed. SpaceX almost died just then. They got the first contract from NASA. On the upbeat nature of that, they survived, got some money. The fourth Falcon 1 and the 5th succeeded, and it's been uphill since then. The first few rockets were
Hey Bill, go ahead and get closer to the mic so we can outlast our Batman friends.
Try that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. So after Kwajalein, then they leased a launch site at Vandenberg, and then beat Jeff Bezos out of leasing historic launch site 39A at the Cape. And there was a protest involved. Elon was closer to launching, so they won. Really, 10 years later, Blue Origin's coming, but very slowly. But they're probably the closest competitor in the huge heavy lifter coming, which we'll talk about later. But since then, Elon's just been audacious. He went back to first principles on everything. He said, why do we throw rockets away? If we had to throw every 737 away after every flight, nobody could fly except the government. It's just crazy. So Elon said, why do we throw them away? Let's try to reuse them. Let's build in enough propellant margin, enough performance margin that we can throw legs on them, boost back, land on a drone ship. Don't ever call it a barge. He'll smack you for that. But now he's landed more than 30 of them, boosters for reuse, cutting costs in half compared to the old space competition, and it's all uphill from what he's doing now. And the future's coming. His current launch vehicles and contracts are pretty much only to lower the costs to low Earth orbit and enable them to invest in the future stuff, which will make us a multiplanetary species. We'll have a backup biosphere off-world at Mars. The moon sort of, even Mars, he says, is a fixer-upper planet, but the moon is worse than that.
Awesome. Sorry, I missed a little bit of that to know where we were going. Bill, thanks for giving some of the history on where we're going with SpaceX. Which one do you guys want to jump in and talk about where we're at now? Chris, go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, we're literally, yesterday the Crew Dragon, came back into port. So we're actually right at that cusp of being able to send U.S. astronauts on U.S. rockets back up to our space station. So we got a Falcon Heavy actual satellite launch, so it's as much fun as it was. Bill and I were out there. We actually saw the Heavy launch, seeing that Tesla launch into, well, it is orbit, so it is orbited.
Yeah.
To actually get a paying customer in there. I mean, because at the end of the day, SpaceX is a business. It's not NASA doing pure exploration. There's a bottom line. There's paying customers moving forward. So that's always the sort of subtle undercurrent as we move from sort of the nation-state race to the private state race. It's like, okay, this is bottom line. And that was always the question, say, like the Falcon Heavy, they had the unfortunate rapid unintended disassembly issues. And so it's like, it was always a question of, okay, when are they gonna launch? Well, they're not gonna blow up that pad because they gotta launch a rocket with a paying customer on side there and go from there. We got Starlink coming, which is their global internet system, so that hopefully will pay some bills. So and the big thing that us SpaceX geeks are all watching, that silver little rocket thing that they're building down in Texas. That's going to be our our true vehicle to get to the moon and eventually onto Mars. So Starship.
Which is currently, it's like a giant looking teapot thing that they're using for the launch tests. It's really funny.
The retro factor of that rocket is beyond cool.
Unbelievable. Elon Musk started SpaceX as a result of a reaction from being denied rocket access from the Russians. His mission was to solve getting things to orbit at a cost-effective rate. You know, we're landing boosters. Mr. Stevens has been trying to catch the upper stage, hasn't worked out successfully so far. I think they might have actually scrapped it. But that brings us to where we are today. So they've got multiple launch vehicles. They've got Falcon 9. Falcon Heavy is going to be doing its first commercial flight sometime in April. We've gotten the ability to now do heavy lift that is actually feasible. And we've actually gotten something accelerated, which is the Back to the Moon project, as a result of, I don't know how to pronounce the guy's name. It's the Japanese billionaire who's behind Dear Moon. So we've now got that. We had a moment, and I don't have my slide with me, but you know, in 1962, Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon. And in 2018, this Japanese billionaire said, I'm going to go to the moon, but with artists. You know, Greg, I'd love to get your take on this return to the moon, because it seemed like it's been 50 years and we've come full circle, going back to where we were before. Talk to us about that.
The real question about the moon is, do you want to go with humans or with robots? Because there are some ideas about how you can make money out of going to the moon, but they're few and far between. I mean, what I like best is that it appears as though the density of rare earths is quite significant at the very top of the lava fields, because in the last cooling phase, their rare earths were somewhat more buoyant. We know that from Apollo and other missions. It's also true that there are some interesting high density things like potassium. And you might be capable of exporting that to Earth profitably, because rare earths are rare, and 90% of the rare earths are known reserves on the planet are in the hands of the Red Chinese. The world is waiting to see when they start squeezing that market, because their rare earths are in all of your electronic devices, and they're getting very, very scarce and expensive. That's one way of looking at it. You could presumably carry out robotic mining of the moon, perhaps profitably. But the real problem is the humans, and the problem with humans is that they use a lot of water because they're mostly made of water. And the interesting issue at the moon is there any large-scale water there at all? There's some at the poles, which I think has been enormously over-advertised, because it's actually not obvious that it's water, although in a mission he's going to talk about in a minute, we'll make it clearer whether it's water. All we know is that it's a significant, interesting number of bound protons in some kind of chemical form in the bottom of craters at the two poles. The problem with the poles that nobody ever wants to talk about is the ambient temperature in these craters is something like 40 or 60 degrees Kelvin, and there's no known machinery that can operate at those temperatures. So the idea of going into such a hostile environment, where it's also very dark, that's why it's cold, and these dumb NASA ideas of let's build up big solar panels to catch the sunlight on pylons and all that, instead of course always trying to avoid using nuclear devices because it's PC. And of course enormously expensive, which NASA always likes. Look at the Webb telescope, you know, a telescope built at the price of a small country. So that avenue for getting any water at all is, I think, doubtful. There's some possibility that there are underground deposits of water, but nobody knows because they've never looked. You have to do very short wavelength seismography to try to see if there's anything near the surface. But it's certainly true that the standard models of the moon don't say there should be much water there. It got firm baked by a collision of a Mars-sized planet with the Earth very early in the history of the Earth. It spun out a big disk, which was extremely hot in itself, blew off all the vapors and the water, and then condensed into the moon. And there's a theory that there was another much even smaller moon further out that eventually fell onto the back of our moon after it had gotten tie-locked to the Earth. The reason we think that is because you notice the Nomaria on the back of the moon, to speak of a few. Well, they apparently got covered over with the crust from a smaller object. And that's why there's a huge asymmetry in the moon, in the composition of the surface. Now, of course, it's also tie-locked to us and has been tie-locked for a long time, because apparently when in the existing models that seem explanatory, after the collision from that Mars-sized object, the Earth's period was about 5 days. Sorry, 5 hours. That's how long the day lasted. And the moon was so big it was illuminating in the sky. The tidal interaction extracts energy from that orbit, and that's why the moon has been moving away from the Earth for the last several billion years. It moves away by about that distance every year. It's still at work, mostly the tidal action in the oceans, a little bit in the crust. So that we think we know roughly the life story of the moon, and it doesn't seem to say that there should be much water there, but we could be wrong. I know it's astonishing in science, but we could be wrong. But we don't know the answer. So human habitation in the end will depend upon the water, and lifting water out of our everyday oceans and putting it on the moon is so hugely expensive. The motive to put humans there is going to have to be substantial. You can do it as what's it called? Flags and footsteps, or boots and footprints. Flags and footprints mission, which is the way we did Apollo, but then it's over, right? I mean, or as Cherry Cornell always said, you know, I wasn't surprised when we went to the moon. I was surprised that we wouldn't do it again. So that's my general take on the moon. And of course, we know there's lots and lots of water on Mars, but it's further away. I actually wrote a short story published over a decade ago saying, look, you want to live off Earth? Here's the smart way to do it. You drop roughly 100 comets onto the surface of the moon, and you give it an atmosphere and a lot of vapor and water and stuff like that. And it's admirably placed, right? It's just a few days flight away. It's the right distance from the sun. You drop this on, the atmosphere will last roughly 10,000 years before it diffuses away. You can replace, after all, there are a lot of comets out there, potential comets. And then you have a colony. The surface area of the moon is roughly the surface area of the exposed land on the whole Earth. So you get another Earth of habitable land with water if you bring it from the outer solar system. Oh, okay, this is not going to be done next year. It won't even be done this century, but you know, here's the kind of obvious answer. If you want to live off Earth and be easy to get to, and the view would be very nice from the moon, and the view of, think about the moon with oceans, seas, maybe shallow, clouds, so forth. The only downside is if we do these calculations, and of course, being a physicist, I did all the calculations for the story, the atmosphere has to be about 6 times thicker to give you the same atmospheric pressure as is right here. Now, you can live with a little less, okay, because look, I have a place in Mammoth where it's only 70% of an atmospheric pressure, and it's okay. Humans can live in that pressure without any real strain. But the problem is, you have a lot of vapor. It's going to be 6 times as deep in height because of it's roughly 1/6 gravity. Actually, it's a little less than a sixth. It's about 0.17. Point is, it's going to be living in Florida. It's going to be hot, really, but it's going to be muggy. That's the worst part. And there's going to be no view because there are going to be clouds all the time between you and the Earth. So, I'm just saying there is some downside to this story. So, if you want to go to the moon and really live there, that's the best way to do it, but you're going to have to wait probably 2 centuries. And that's why, so the end of my talk here is to suggest that you all get cryonics contracts.
Your friends will be super jealous. It doesn't matter the view if you're spending your vacation on the moon. Just saying.
Hey, you're already dead with cryonics, so where's the downside?
So, Michael, you have a lot of years of experience in projects around observing the moon. Tell us about those and tell us where we're going with them.
Well, I'm just sitting here crossing the things off my list that Dr. Benford was saying. I can talk about that.
Yeah, I do that.
I did want to say something. I haven't done a lot of these panels, but having Gregory and his colleagues, they tend to be more entertaining if everybody doesn't agree about everything. So I'm going to take the counter Elon Musk fanboy position here. I will start by saying I'm certainly an admirer of him. I certainly think that having watched nothing happen in this business going from being a kid to now, the fact that there are now movers and shakers, people bringing in different business models, different ways of doing things, and actually delivering on that, I'm enormously enthusiastic about that. And I think what I always end up saying about SpaceX is if we do 1/4 of what Elon says and it takes 4 times longer, he still change the world, and that's great. So I think it's always important having these discussions to separate out the stuff that's coming out of his mouth at any given time with where they end up. I met with a woman from SpaceX last year, who on her business card had said she was their director of Mars programs, and we were talking about what they were doing. This is the point. They were still claiming they were going to launch a mission, it was 2 years ago. They were going to launch a mission in 2018 that was going to land on Mars. And I said, well, that's not going to happen, right? And she said, well, it's very unlikely. And I said, I mean, it doesn't. If you do it in 2024, it's still hugely important, and it would be a tremendous contribution. So I don't know why he says this shit, but he does, but it's part of the shtick, I guess. So I think it's great, and especially because it's not just him, it's also Bezos, and to some degree, I want to count them Virgin Galactic. So I think that's all great. It's tremendously exciting that this is going on, because having spent my professional career as a money-grubbing aerospace contractor doing work on a cost reimbursement basis, cost reimbursement contracting does not result in things being more cost-effective, which is why rockets have not gotten more expensive over decades. So I think this is all great and wonderful. Back to your question. Yeah, I mean, what Dr. Benford said, I think there's a big fork in the road here on whether there's economically extractable water on the moon. I think if there is, I think that makes a whole lot of things more easy and accessible. If you have to bring water up from the ground, then that's going to be more expensive, and then that comes back to the question of what is going to be the price curve of providing stuff, putting stuff in space. And again, Elon says lots of things, and I wish him the best of luck, and I would love to live in the world where everything that he said actually happened, but I have a fair amount of skepticism to what degree it will happen and how long it will take. So, and as Gregory mentioned, we have 3 cameras orbiting the moon right now. We've mapped almost all of the moon at meter resolution, which turns out to be a lot of pixels.
And monoliths, right?
Not that we've seen so far, and I think it turns out, even though it's been more than 1 million pictures, the crew at Arizona State University that actually operated the camera, I think they managed to have at least one human being at some point scan through each picture, so we don't have any pictures that somebody hasn't looked at. But they're really big pictures. I've had the experience, the pictures we take every time there's a human artifact on the moon, we take a picture of it. So all these pictures of the Apollo sites. And I showed some of these pictures in my talk yesterday, and so I have this picture, and you can see the descent stage of the lunar module, and that's really cool and interesting. But the picture that comes back from the moon is like this really huge picture that's like 50,000 lines long. And I've had the experience of it's in this picture. I spent 20 minutes trying to find it, because it's something that's, the size of this table, and it's in a, couple hundred square miles of a picture, so it's, even though the moon's smaller than the Earth, it's still pretty big. So we are right now developing a camera that's a variant of one of the cameras we have on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter now for an upcoming Korean lunar orbiter mission. The variant aspect is it's designed to be able to get good signal to noise in these permanently shadowed regions of the poles that have been theorized to be cold traps where there could be water. The data from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has 7 different instruments on it, is kind of mixed. There are some indications, like the neutron experiment, that indicate that there is hydrogen there in some form. There's other instruments that seem to show higher reflectivity than you'd expect, which you kind of expect if there's water on the surface. Other instruments seem to be indicating the opposite, so it's all very mixed. So, hey, we need better data, so let's send another mission. So that's what we're working on now. I'm hoping that will disambiguate this, and obviously at some point I'm hoping that we'll find water, because I think that the things get more interesting more quickly if there's economically usable water on the surface. Even if it's at 40 degrees, because I think that's I'm not saying that that's not a hard problem, but it is a technical problem, and it has technical solutions. So, and I suspect compared to dragging it up from the oceans on Earth, it's probably still a win.
That's true. Note, by the way, that liquid nitrogen, which is used for cryonic storage, is at 77 degrees Kelvin. So we're really talking about very, very cold, where no known machinery works.
Well, but the other point to keep in mind is you're talking about very, very cold in a vacuum. So it's not like, I don't know, flying something around on Titan where you're in, 1.5 bars of pressure. It's a massive convective heat sink. So there's
What are you talking about the Titan flyer?
Oh, well, this is a little preview. I'm giving a talk about this later today, but since he asked.
This is pretty cool. Go ahead.
I'm not making any money off this, I'll tell you that.
We'll still be attending.
The next mission of the outer solar system that NASA is going to do is in a competition right now. It's down to 2 different mission concepts. One is a mission that would bring back a sample of a comet nucleus, which is pretty cool. And then the other is a mission that would land and then fly a nuclear-powered drone on Titan, Saturn's moon. So, as I was just alluding to, that's really, really cool, but there's some real technical problems with that because dealing with cold in a vacuum is one thing, because in a vacuum, except where you're walking around the ground, it's all about radiation, and that's a lot less efficient in transferring heat than being in a bath of nitrogen at a pressure greater than this room where you've got convective transfer of heat, which is orders of magnitude more efficient. So building a machine that's going to fly around on Titan, the temperature of around 100 Kelvin, soaking in this bath of 100 Kelvin liquid nitrogen, that's a real problem.
And you guys might have noticed a trend here with Dr. Benford and Dr. Levine talking, is that the first space race that started back in the 50s was very much government driven. It was much more about exploration. And this modern space race, it's private industry, so it's all about the economics. And you heard both Dr. Levine and Benford talk about what's going to make this viable. What's the cost going to be to get water? Are there going to be resources that we can access? So one of the things that's going to be very different about this space race is it's got to be always, the end run has to be bringing value back to the businesses and back to the people behind this. So it's going to be very critical. And it's important too, because that's how these things get funded, right? Governments can be fickle and they're supposed to respond to the people. So long as businesses have a way that they can produce capital out of this, space exploration can go on forever. So like this is a path to space that actually becomes sustainable.
Right. The reason the U.S. didn't go back is because we won the space race, but we lost the ratings race. They stopped Apollo because nobody was watching the mission after a while, because it was the same guys walking around on the same place, and it lost out to what was it? It wasn't I Love Lucy, but nobody was watching it, so game over, and that was the Nixon administration for you. Well, they did some other things too.
Real quick, you want to comment on that, Michael?
Well, no, I wanted to get in another little bit of Elon Musk snark here. There's one of these, it's like the old joke, the professor standing in front of a blackboard and he's got a bunch of equations on it, and then in the middle there's this step that says, then a miracle occurs. One of the things that I think reflects well on Elon is that he figured out fairly early on that all of this new space garbage was not going to do him any good in the near term. And the way he was going to make money in the near term was by selling stuff to the United States government. And so that's where SpaceX right now is just another part, it's just another big aerospace company. Because of what they're doing and because of how they approach it, as their costs come down, the prospect of them doing things that are not governmental obviously looms large. And I agree completely that that is where we want to be. And again, I wish him the best of luck. But I just feel intellectually I have to distinguish between some end goal that we all agree we'd like to get to and where we are right now, which is he's just selling stuff to the government.
Yeah, right now it's all primarily government contracts. Yep. Let me jump back over to this side of the table and to you, Chris. What's the most important thing that you see happening with what SpaceX is doing? What's the biggest impact they're doing that a lot of people are thinking about or kind of realize? Like, what do you think that is?
Well, actually, you briefly touched on the end of Apollo with the lack of public interest, and I think that's where Elon understands the world in a little different fashion. I mean, the fact that he put the Roadster to try to reignite sort of just this general sort of rebirth. And that's why we really do kind of call it this renaissance. I mean, you're all in here wanting to know about this company. And I think a lot of what we're seeing that could happen is going to keep motivating Elon outside the business world and everything, is this public interest and drive. I mean, when we were out there for the Falcon Heavy launch, you know, there's a Best Western, it's like, there's a rocket launch and there's a car in it, you know, on their billboard. And that was really interesting to see. I don't know how many people have seen that, the new Apollo 11 movie, but to see all those people on the beach, and it's like to see that rebirth, that's going to keep kind of fueling the cycle of moving forward, I think, with us. And there's that passion. It's almost like we went through the Dark Ages. And, you know, us slightly younger people, you know, missed out on, you know, what, you know, Bill got to see, you know. I was born in '68. I don't remember the moon landings. You know, I'm a shuttle kid. So I think a lot of that is starting to come into play. And, you know, it's like, how many of us are promised flying cars? You know, we want that hope. We want that, you know, that drive and that passion. And I think that's what Elon and SpaceX brings to the table.
They want flying cars too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, he's sort of actually flying in a tunnel. I think he's kind of taking care of us.
Don't you feel like a rover kid too? I mean, isn't a rover an important part of the whole space program? I mean, these things have been scooting around for miles, and they weren't expected to last that long.
You know, I have a good friend who actually, she was an opportunity driver. You know, so I mean, it's nice to actually, you know, figure out how to shift, you know, responsibilities. You know, robotic exploration, you know, is great because they can get out there ahead of us and figure out what we need to do. You know, we've talked about the water. We're really starting to understand, you know, Mars, you know, the moon's kind of this sort of forgotten stepchild. Oh, she's just right there. You know, it's that passion of exploration sort of reigniting and bringing that back to the table in a way that theoretically can be economically done.
Yeah, I have a question. How many people in this room got teary-eyed when they saw the last reports from Opportunity? Yeah. My batteries are getting low and it's getting dark.
Yeah.
I'm not crying, you're crying.
And the Philae lander going to sleep, like a Boy Scout putting out his sleeping bag. You know, I'll wake up someday, I hope.
Go ahead, Bill.
The thing that Elon took some heat for was being a showman. He threw the Roadster in there as a big secret. That first got leaked on Reddit, I think, from an employee. They went through a huge investigation trying to find out who leaks stuff. But man, it's so tempting to leak things. And now they've pretty much gotten Elon to be the chief leaker. He leaks all kinds of great stuff. But man, they criticized him for being a showman, for putting a Roadster out. Well, everybody else on the first test of a new rocket puts up a chunk of steel or a bunch of water or concrete, just some test mass. They don't do anything inspirational and outrageous. That's pretty outrageous. And then when we saw, oh man, there's a Starman in there with a spacesuit, a working, tested, didn't do anything, didn't move. We were hoping to move his arm once. But you know, it was just outrageous to do that, and it's on a heliocentric orbit that goes past Mars. That was a propulsion test. Nobody knew what delta V they would actually get out of it. They predicted, but nobody was sure it would go much past Mars. But Starman's out there. They did an outrageous thing and put another, they can't call them crash test dummies anymore because they don't crash and they're not really dumb, they're really smart. But they put another star gal in the Crew Dragon and said, hey, that's Ripley. And we all said, oh yeah, right, I had a poster of her. I had a poster of her in college. And they put Globy, or little Buddy, as a, you know, like in the Soyuz capsules, they always have like something hanging from the rear view mirror that goes woo woo when they stage. So we had We had a little Buddy or Globey up on the Crew Dragon, and the ISS crew stole it as a mascot. That was supposed to come back. And we said, "Wow." And they've done
And what are you going to do? Go to space to take it back from them? Like, really?
Yeah, on DM2.
Yeah, that is the plan. DM2.
We're going to steal it back. Or SpaceX will steal it back. But yeah, it's sort of inspirational, sort of outrageous. Elon does outrageous things, but sometimes he trolls people. Yeah, on an interview once, they were saying, you know, why go to Mars? It sort of sucks. And he says, yes, it's a fixer-upper planet, but a few nukes over the poles and you can improve it a lot. And people went nuts. Nukes? Are you kidding me? No, impractical. But he got people talking about it, you know? So he trolls.
Can I say a little bit about this? This is just, and I want to say something good about Elon. It's sort of one of the cheap ironies certainly about what I do, but I think I'm not unique in this. This entire exploration of space thing, I think, taps emotionally into something that certainly, especially Americans, relate to very strongly, in the frontier and all that kind of stuff. And so there's this deep wellspring of desire that we do these sorts of things and this enthusiasm for it. The actual execution of it, as done by the government, is one of the most bureaucratic, heavily regulated things. And the juxtaposition of those two things is sort of like the fundamental irony of my life, because I do this because of, you know, being starry-eyed, 9-year-old and thinking this was great. But I will not bore you with all the things that I have to do that are not things that the starry-eyed 9-year-old would have thought were very much fun in order to do what we do, which is send stuff all around the solar system. So one of the things that I take a great deal of pleasure out of is that because, you know, Elon's in charge of what Elon is doing, he can do this kind of crazy shit like putting cars on rockets and just do it, and there's not 17,000 bureaucrats behind him wringing their hands saying, well, no, well, you can't do, how would that look? Or he just does it, and that's really cool. So the showman thing, yeah, I think that's really great.
So before we open this up to audience questions, how many people in the room saw the Falcon Heavy launch? And so even if you saw it later. Awesome, all right, good number. How many people alive at the time, or were alive at the time, and saw the first moon landing? Oh wow, great number. So between the moon landing and the Falcon, it's an interesting split. So a number of folks in this room have seen both. The folks who didn't see the moon landing have seen the launch of the Falcon Heavy, and I think for the modern era of space, that really is the next turning point of people actually tuning in and paying attention to where we're going.
Most people saw Spaceship One's first launch.
Let me ask one little story. I asked Elon, except for, other than Star Mountain, what other things were proposed? And he said, well, several people proposed selling the burial rights. That is, to put a dead person in the launch and put him into orbit forever. And he said, he asked some people to look into it. He said, we could have gotten a fairly large amount of money with that. I pointed out to him that Timothy Leary, when he decided not to do cryonics, had himself put in orbit, but they burned him first. He came back down in a matter of a few days. But the point is, this would be permanent internment in the solar system, riding a Tesla. So,
you want to know the best way to get rid of a body?
You can dominate this market.
and add one thing to that, a lot of people don't know. SpaceX actually offered the payload to NASA. They offered it to NASA to use for any experimental projects, and NASA passed. So for anybody who felt like, oh, they just did it as a commercial stunt, like this was one of the last choices that they actually ended up with. They offered it to science first. Yeah, okay, so we'd love to open it up here to questions. I know there in the back, I believe you had one earlier.
My comment was just, the mission for the moon exploration, and when we might see 50 people on the moon, how many years from now?
Michael or Greg, you guys might be best equipped to answer that.
Well, it depends on, it depends on when you get this big rocket working. I'm glad you asked that because it gives me the opportunity to make this observation. I'm not a real physicist like Dr. Benford, but I do have a degree in it, so I feel it necessary to work physics into these things at some point. So you've all seen this. He's got this model of this big rocket in Texas. He's going to build this big rocket. He's going to put 80 people on it. And it doesn't, I don't think you have to think about that very long. You're saying like, oh my God, I understand, why didn't somebody do that before? And to zeroth order, there's a very simple thing. Our entire manned space program was architected on the idea that a mission was one launch. Everything that had happened was dependent on one launch because launches were viewed as being extremely risky. The entire thing of, I got this big spaceship and I put 40 people on it, I'm gonna fly to the moon, I'm gonna fly to the Mars, is predicated idea that you put it into orbit and you refuel it, which is, I mean, you can have a separate discussion about all the logistics that are associated with that, but that's the only reason that works, because you can't build a rocket that looks like that and fly to the moon without refueling it after it's already in space.
We're eventually going to have to do assembly and refueling in orbit, and I've talked about this to Elon for over a decade, and he said, yeah, that's got to be done. And of course, using nuclear rockets with something simple like water as the spent fluid, that actually makes good economic sense. But it won't be done until it's done by a private company, because NASA has always rejected that solution.
And nuclear rockets are coming. Like, there's absolutely no doubt about this.
Actually, they lie in the past.
Yes, but they're coming back.
But here's a news item. The Chinese are running a nuclear rocket program right now. They bought the old Soviet program intact, which was from the subsurface testing the Soviets did pseudo-secretly.
Pseudo.
At Semipalatinsk, in case you're interested.
Awesome. Go ahead, right here in the middle.
Yeah, me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you were saying how, from what I was understanding earlier, you were saying how unlikely it was to put like a moon base or something like that, set up one. So it's more viable to live on Mars than it is to live on the moon. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, Mars has a thin atmosphere, but at least it's some. Plus, it has lots and lots of water.
Okay.
So, right, although Mars may be further, it's got more of the resources that we need, basically. Go ahead, you had a question?
So, not a lot of science, not a lot of, just a fan. I'm really, grew up with Stanley Kubrick's vision in 2001 and having that as a basis for everything that I imagine space to be. How close are we even to something like that, where the moon is like the launch pad for everything else that we do?
Bill, Chris, how do you guys want to jump on this one?
My quick answer is probably, when you throw the Elon Musk time factor in there, within a decade. Probably less. Your thought?
Yeah, I believe we'll have inflatable station up there before we'll have a solid one like Burton and Brown proposed in the 50s. But yeah, we're close to an orbital hotel, but it's not Elon's mission.
The Bigelow Hotel, the first one, isn't inflatable.
I'm just imagining a bouncy house. The most expensive bouncy house of all time. Go ahead.
This is sort of a political question, I guess, but we have treaties about Mars and the moon, about what you can do and so forth, came to the UN. And I'm wondering how enforceable those treaties actually are.
They won't be.
They're bullshit treaties, and there is no Mars treaty. I mean, these are meaningless treaties.
That's kind of what I was asking.
Yeah, ignore them.
Yeah, and actually, for me as a historian, I'm actually concerned about preserving the Apollo sites. That is a tension I have with the private company, because these treaties, yeah, you could drop down, walk over, and I'm going to take this lander, step over the footprints or whatever. So as a historian, I'm actually really concerned about what do we do as we step onto the moon, and thinking ahead, when we step onto Mars the first time, which is probably going to be a private landing.
Great question. Go ahead. Right here, Leon.
Hi, I used to work at Rockwell in Downey for 2 years, and the way the company made money was to charge the government for our hours with a markup. And one day I realized that meant that if we found a way to work smarter, the company lost money. So I'm really excited that private industry is working in a non-Alice in Wonderland environment now. Has there been any announcement of by SpaceX of an intention to eventually do mining, like asteroid mining? Because I think that's going to be the gold rush.
So SpaceX's mission is about getting vehicles and getting payloads to orbit. They will probably likely carry something that is involved in mining. So their whole mission, Elon's whole mission, is to make getting to space cheap enough that other companies can leverage services and develop technologies to solve problems like that.
Yeah.
Like I think even a lot of the habitats and all these things are going to be required for actually building on Mars. SpaceX will have no hand in that. They're just going to be the launch vehicle and the delivery mechanism.
There are two companies devoted to mining now. The biggest one, I think, is Planetary Resources. But they're both, I believe, in Seattle, right?
Yeah, the people who made the most money on average during the gold rushes were the ones who sold wheelbarrows.
And blue jeans.
Yeah. The secondary products. Okay, good. We got a question in the back.
If you set up a family, would it be like an experienced family like the Robinsons?
I sure hope so.
That's all I wanted.
That's awesome.
Or the Richards, you know.
Go ahead.
I was kind of curious. The Crew Dragon ship, they're not going to reuse it for crew. Is that just they don't feel the technology is mature enough? But the risk.
It costs too much to refurb right now.
Ah,
But
that's simply refurbished.
To human standards, they can refurb it and use it for cargo.
Oh, okay.
That's the plan.
Good question. I see we got one in the corner in the back.
Is there any examination done of possible economic benefits of offering to clean up space? Because we've got a lot of junk up there.
This is something I was talking to
Several people have looked at that in their various methods. The trick is there's no profit in it yet unless the nations responsible for it put a bounty charge, which is something like in the range of maybe $1,000 a kilogram or some number like that. But the easy thing to do is to get the big stuff, which fractionates a lot when it collides. And there's been an economic analysis done of it, but until there's a profit motive, until there are international treaties to reward it, it won't get done.
And I hope that that isn't a result of some pretty significant satellites getting knocked out of the air, but unfortunately humans tend to be pretty reactionary, so something bad will probably happen in space before I think we'll get that large reaction, large international agreement to actually do something about it.
Yeah, I concur with that. Yeah.
We're
gonna have a real life gravity moment.
Yeah, no, exactly. We're gonna have a disaster, and someone's gonna die, something's gonna happen, and then we'll do something about it. Go ahead, question.
This is a real question, Mike. You could collect the debris and sell them as souvenirs.
Yeah, people on this table here would definitely buy it.
It's easy, but it's much cheaper to just let it burn in the atmosphere.
By the way, I need to get that domain right now. You got a question, Andrew?
Yes, just to follow up on, you were talking about the refurbishment.
Yeah.
I heard that the original plan for Crew Dragon was to land on land, which might have made refurbishment easier. Are there plans to eventually land on land, or are they just always going to be?
NASA's requirements for human rating and testing, the legs that have to penetrate the heat shield were onerous and not worth it. They may do propulsive landing for cargo, where on land. Right. Then the refurb is fast, cheap, no salt water involved.
Right.
Awesome. Question.
Is the talk going to be online?
Yes, actually, we do have it recorded. I'll put it up on YouTube. It'll be on my YouTube channel, which is called My Tesla Adventure. My pleasure. Any last comments or thoughts anybody on the panel wants to add that they didn't get to talk about already?
Read Artemis, the very nice Andy Weir novel of last year, in which the Apollo landing site 11 is the tourist site that drives the first colony on the moon. Just plain old tourism. It's a good novel, and being made into a movie right now.
Should be awesome.
It's the same funding as the Martian.
Are they going to strand that name in again this time? It's gotten real expensive to say. It doesn't follow that whole thing. We've had to save an Interstellar.
The protagonist of Artemis is a Muslim woman. So.
Maybe not. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody who attended, and most importantly, let's give a round of applause for our panelists.